Hello from the Wilson Center. I'm Rob Jenkins. Before starting my fellowship here, I enjoyed a 26-year career at the United States Agency for International Development, where I most recently served as assistant to the administrator for the Bureau for Conflict Prevention and Stabilization. As part of the Wilson Quarterly's Fall 2024 issue, focusing on the future of humanitarian assistance, I am pleased to moderate a discussion between two experts on the topic. Jamie McGoldrick, who recently served as the UN's Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Coordination, and Nimo Hassan, currently serving as Executive Director of the Somali NGO Consortium and Board Chair of ICVA, a group of more than 160 NGOs working to improve collective humanitarian action. Jamie is an old friend, Nimo is a new friend, and I'm thrilled to have them here today for this discussion. Jamie, we met almost 30 years ago in Sierra Leone, when that beautiful country and its people were being ravished by a horrendous civil war. And I don't want to downplay the war or its effects at all, but regarding humanitarian assistance, I think it was almost a simpler time. Things weren't as complicated. I would say they weren't as technical. Sometimes it felt like a bunch of young people just running around trying to do the right thing. Over the course of your career, what is the biggest changes? What has changed the most? And what are the biggest differences now as opposed to, back then?
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, looking back that time, things were simpler. I mean, obviously, there's a lot more professionalism, as you mentioned, in the system, but I think with that comes much more bureaucracy and much more, and with, the positive is the predictability, improved response through various iterations of humanitarian reform. But I think that world politics has gotten a lot more toxic in that same time. A much darker place, obviously, 7th of October, what's happening in Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, the most tragic conflicts. I think these places are the worst time for a child, a health worker, humanitarian, and journalist. I think that what's happened is that the modern conflicts have impacted protection of civilians much more and the safety of, and the actual attacks on healthcare workers and premises we've seen. But I think also with that, there's a blatant disregard for international humanitarian law and the refugee law that we used to guide and work ourselves by. There's this lack of accountability. And I would say, my personal view, I haven't seen of it in Gaza recently, the creeping normalization of the violations of international humanitarian law. And I think that we have to, recognize that because more and more people are getting killed and injured, premises destroyed. I think that global institutions that were out there to try and guide political and diplomatic peacemaking, I think they have lost some of the credibility. The Security Council, the ICJ and ICC, I think they're leaking credibility in many ways. And I think there's this part and parcel of a new world disorder. And with that, I think our ability to work, to navigate, to perform, and to respond to people in growing needs, we were affected negatively. And I think also with that, the humanitarian principles that we should hold as the sort of the way that we work within modern warfare, I think that with the increasing presence of like non-state actors and the very complex environments we work in, trying to get access, humanitarian access, we see in Gaza, we've seen elsewhere, Sudan, it's the deconfliction to try and negotiate has become much more tiresome, much more difficult, and much more tragic for humanitarian workers. And I think that's something we have to recognize as the current world we work in. That means some people see the sort of the fall or the undermining of humanitarian principles. People call it resistance humanitarianism, neutrality. You give up in Ukraine and you side with Ukraine rather than being more neutral to the whole of the humanitarian needs there. So I think there's some really negative issues out there right now. And as humanitarians, we have to be much more politically minded and much more savvy about that because of the politicization of the aid, the instrumentalization of aid, the conditionality of aid. And I think the widespread interference and the serious double standards out there in terms of different crises. So that's what I would say the current world is for me.
Well, thanks, Jamie. That's a lot to deal with, and it definitely is a much more complicated, complex, difficult environment. I think in 2024 is now on pace to be the deadliest ever for humanitarian workers, and we're just in October now. Nimo, you have a different perspective because not only has things changed in the sector, but things have changed in Somalia a lot over the last few decades. So what would you add to this from what you've seen as the differences and changes over the last 2 or 3 decades?
Yeah, no, great. Thank you very much for having me. And I agree a lot with what Jamie has said. Going back to the Somali situation, the humanitarian assistance has undergone a significant changes as well as adaptation over the years due to the evolving crisis, shifting priorities, and even lessons learned on what's been, this prolonged crisis over 30 years long. There is now a greater emphasis to rebuild resilience and recovery rather than just focusing on the emergency response itself. The country seeing its stabilization a bit more, with the federal government system. It comes with its weaknesses and problems, but there is a little bit more stability now where it enables for us to design programs that are more enabling for communities to recover. I mean, it's different. We obviously cannot paint Somalia with one brush because the regions offer different instabilities and access for humanitarians and delivery of aid. We also have increased recognition that the importance of having local knowledge, which has led to more partnerships with national partners and contributing to the localization agenda and subsequently leading to a timely and effective humanitarian assistance. There's also a stronger focus on the specific needs on women and children and other marginalized groups as well, with ensuring protection measures are integrated into the humanitarian response. So it's evolved a lot more than just being an emergency relief. So there are programs that, there are consortia actually of NGOs that are combining a bit of the humanitarian response with recovery and resilience building on targeting specific issues. For instance, health centers in IDP camps often include safe spaces for women and girls where they can access GBV-related counseling and legal services. Healthcare workers are also trained to identify and respond to sexual and gender-based violence cases and ensure survivors receive the medical, psychosocial, and legal support that they require. So it's a lot more integrated. Like I said, it's not the same case in all the different regions in Somalia. There are areas which are more stable, more peaceful, where you can think about delivering a longer term programs on education, making sure that we have a quality education as well. The humanitarian actors in Somalia have adopted innovative delivery mechanisms of aid with increased resilience on cash-based assistance as well, and remote programming to reach those affected populations, especially the ones that are in hard-to-reach areas where there's lack of instability and insecurity, or actors who non-state actors are present. So I think there are diversity in the way we deliver humanitarian response as well. Back to you, Jamie. Back to you, Rob. Sorry.
That's fine. I'd love to be confused with Jamie. He doesn't like to be confused with me, unfortunately. Yeah, back in the 90s, we used to joke and dream about cash-based assistance. If only we could just hand out cash and not have to worry about all those extra mechanisms. And I don't think protection was a word that meant what it means today. So there are a lot of good things that have changed and a lot of things that have, the integration you mentioned. You also mentioned local led actors. And as you know, Nimo, localization now is all the rage. It's the buzz. Everyone's talking about it all the time. USAID just came out with a locally led humanitarian assistance policy. I'm quite skeptical, frankly, that a lot of what is being said is touted as success in the space. I think there's a lot more words than action, and I think that a lot of agencies, organizations are saying they're doing things more than they are doing things, to put people-centered assistance at the center of what's happening and to utilize local organizations and local knowledge. You have a great perspective on this. So should I be skeptical, or are good things happening, or is it a mixed bag, Nimo?
I would say you're right to be skeptical, but also I think it's a mix of good and things need to be improved in advancing the localization agenda. I think it depends on where you're looking at, and in terms of the as we talked about, the evolving situation of the humanitarian response. I think in the last 8 years, there's been improvement on a better inclusion of local actors into the response. It is becoming an increasingly important strategy in humanitarian assistance, particularly in Somalia, because it's an approach which focuses on enhancing the capacity of local organizations and communities to lead and implement aid efforts. Now, having said that, there are challenges, and I think some of the challenges in completely flipping the coins, rather than its top-down design, and for us to focus a bottom-up design, it's the siloed approach of how funding is allocated as well. I think that makes a difficulty in ensuring that we are better synergizing when it comes to designing programs. So you have your development envelope, you have your humanitarian envelope, and you've got your resilience envelope, you've got your peace building envelope. I think that makes it difficult in better integrating the response. But there are a lot of good things that are happening. There are consortiums of national NGOs who have come together to ensure that they are complementing to how they're delivering programs, and that is strengthened, gives the donors the confidence to support them directly. But it's different on how what the appetite for risk is for the donors. I think it's moving in slowly, but it's moving in the right direction. I think if I want to summarize it in that sense. There are better inclusion of national NGOs in the design, in the implementation, in sharing the fund with international NGOs. I think they're doing a better job in other actors as well, actually, because we have big local Somali-led NGOs that are at the forefront, that are delivering multi-sectorial programming as well. But it's not a blanket. There's still challenges, like I said, in the risk sharing, in the for local partners to access funding directly from donors. I think the smaller donors might be able to take that risk a bit more than the bigger donors. And I think there needs to be a lot more change in our mindsets in how we did things traditionally, and embrace the change a bit more. And in that sense, we can be fast-paced in delivering assistance and the essential recovery that communities, vulnerable communities need. So I think we really do. The system is too slow. The system needs to move a lot faster so that we are supporting communities to lift themselves out of poverty, rather than drip feeding them, rather than it being top-down design. So there are good programs that are happening, but it needs to be at scale, and it needs to be sustained. There needs to be more flexible funding to ensure that we are changing with this complexity in terms of landscape as well. Yeah.
I heard sustained, I heard scale, I heard flexibility, things we talk a lot about and it's hard to achieve. So Jamie, from your perch, UN coordinator, big time guy, looking over the entire spectrum of an operation, not just recently, but also in Yemen and other places, how do you think the sector's doing at putting affected populations in the driver's seat?
I think they talk a good game, that's for sure. You mentioned USAID. I mean, they've championed localization, as you mentioned. I'd like to see percentage-wise how much money they've actually given over directly to national NGOs and not through international implementing partners. I get a sense that the international community actually localizes when they don't want to put themselves in harm's way. And Nimo says there about in Somalia. I mean, that's a place where the international community is taking a step back from when it comes to the more critical parts of it. We see it now in Sudan as well. So for me, localization has become a bit of a rallying cry among humanitarians in recent years. You called it a buzzword. I think it's focused on putting power and funding in the hands of local responders. But I think it's a feel-good term, and it's a bit of a cop-out, I think. And for me personally, it's not just a case of scale and speed, it's a case of commitment. The international power structures and the international humanitarian power structures, they remain the same, with no significant attempt to decolonize. And then, the decisions, as Nimo says, about funding, it rests with the same cluster heads, the same big organizations. We've put out accountability affected populations, putting people at the center, all this kind of stuff. And that's been there since 2016 when we had the World Humanitarian Summit. But for me, I think Nino's point about there is locally developing community-driven aid initiatives taking place, smaller donors involved in as well. And I think that's what we have to look to as the future. I mean, you have to look at Sudan right now. The international community is sitting in many places outside, away from the actual heart of the matter, in Port Sudan and elsewhere. And in the meantime, you've got national organizations working these emergency response rooms, struggling for funding. It's mostly crowdsourced funding they use. They're not getting international funding. There's a reticence among donors to hand over funding because of the worry about fraud and mismanagement and all this kind of stuff. At the same time, you have this counter-terrorism legislation out there as well. So I think for me, it's more important now that we actually grasp this properly. It's been going on now for more than 10 years, and we haven't done anything significant to change that. And I think this so-called participation of the revolution of actors from the global south, it's not been furthered in any decisive way. So for me, I would hope that with the cuts that are taking place right now, United Kingdom, Germany, and others have announced they're cutting back in humanitarian assistance. Well, it's a cheaper model to move to localization. So I think now is the time to take a start look at it. Big NGOs such as Save the Children Fund, Rescue, International Rescue Committee, and people like Norwegian People's Aid, they've all had funding cuts and they've had staff cuts. They should manage that and hand over in a sort of a managed way to national actors and empower them and resource them and give them the opportunity to go and the backing. And unfortunately, I don't think it's happening systemically enough. It's not happening fast enough, and it's not happening except when there's danger to fraud, or danger to the negative part, or danger to the NGO international being put in harm's way. So I'm not entirely enthused about localization. I think it's something that comes out of these policy meetings, and I don't think that necessarily helps operations.
Well, Nimo touched on it. You both touched on it, which is the appetite for risk. And how many people are we willing to let die for the sake of compliance? What's necessary is a true paradigm shift. We're seeing this now in Sudan, as you pointed out, Jamie. We saw it in the early days of Ukraine. The inability of the humanitarian sector and if the architecture isn't there or it doesn't have access, the international donors are standing on the sidelines, finding a hard way to find new ways to implement when there are able and willing partners there. They just don't have the same technical language and they don't have the same compliance things in place. You mentioned the World Humanitarian Summit, and yes, it's been 8 years, Nimo. 8 years of talking about, as you mentioned, humanitarian development, peace building, the nexus. Not a lot's happened in 8 years, but people often say there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. At some point, with 80% of humanitarian assistance needs being caused by, I will say man-made, I won't say people-made, it's pretty much man-made. These are conflicts, these are wars, and they're not gonna end with airdrops, they're gonna end with negotiations. So at some point, the diplomats have to get involved, the politicians have to get involved, and that's peace building. It's inherently political. So if you want to have this nexus of humanitarian development and peace building, how can you do that? Is it even possible and still maintain humanitarian principles? Nimo?
Yeah, no, great question. There's a lot of skepticism as well on the so-called nexus, as people say it. But I personally think it's possible. I think yes, it's possible to integrate humanitarian efforts into development and peace building while maintaining humanitarian principles, but it does require a delicate balance and a strong commitment to safeguard humanitarian values. If that balance isn't clear and isn't adhered to all actors, I think it will be difficult for us to do that. Humanitarian action is grounded in principles like impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Although, as Jamie earlier said, there's been a disregard for these as well at the global scale. Now, these principles are essential in gaining access to people in need and providing assistance without political interference. However, the root causes, as you said, Rob, of many crises are conflict or instability and poverty, which are all inherently political, which requires a long-term solutions, often requires a combination, as you said, of diplomacy, development, peace-building efforts. And this is where the challenge lies. So we really have to be intentional about how we want to do that, and ensure that there is a clear, a delicate balance between the two. And in countries like in Somalia, the persistent insecurity, including violence from militia groups, hampers access to vulnerable populations and complicates the implementation of integrated programs. And also political fragmentation due to the federal system of governance and the lack of effective governance is another factor hampering efforts to align humanitarian development and peace building initiatives. So it's not only at the global level, but also at the specific country and community level as well. Despite the challenges, there are opportunities for better integrated response, particularly in Somalia. One such opportunity is those organizations who have the mixed mandate of delivering assistance, delivering governance and peace building, but also development and development programs as well, and how they can integrate and ensure that those are talking to each other. I think is really important to communicate, to ensure that you are aligning, you're supporting a particular communities, and you're aligning your various different programs. And NGOs, and particularly local NGOs, are actually better placed to deliver the nexus because they're with the community, they're the forefront, they need to be empowered to be able to articulate those various programs that they're doing. So I think one area, although as I said earlier, the donors seem to be a lot more siloed, where they have the development envelope and the humanitarian envelope completely separate, sometimes in different buildings, don't even talk to each other as well. But I think one opportunity is for us to empower those local partners who are within the community, who understand the context, who are there before and after crisis happens, to empower them, to support them, to give them the proper support they need in terms of technical capacities, but also funding for us to integrate those development, the nexus approach, so that it enhances the community's ability to withstand those shocks, as I said. So, yeah.
Nimo, I couldn't agree with you more that it all comes together with local organizations. And often we force our silos upon them. They're not trying to decide, am I doing peace building today, development tomorrow, and humanitarian assistance next Wednesday? They're just getting it done, and they're doing what needs to be done. Jamie, I'm sure you have views on this.
Yeah, I have. I mean, I think that Nexus is, as Nimo says, stressing the idea of bringing those different strands of international response is a good way forward. Maybe it's a bit naive in some contexts, I think. I mean, aid politics are politics. I mean, the humanitarians are aware of political interference. It's not an equal partnership. You look at, you mentioned peacekeeping missions and special political missions. In those environments, the humanitarians do the work to negotiate access, develop a response, but they don't have a seat at the political table, you know. But that said, if you remember Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths, all the worldwide crisis over the last 3 years, be it Ukraine or Ethiopia or Sudan, he was the one that was dispatched by the Secretary General. So where were the politicals and the diplomats in that one there? And World Food Programme head David Beasley often called out diplomats when they criticised his efforts in mediation and diplomacy. And he said, well, why don't you do your job and prevent these from further escalating? So I think we have to have a conversation, but I do think we might be lost in translation. As Nino says, I think the critical part, and you mentioned it as well, is actually our efforts to engage with communities who are affected. And this, instead of as humanitarians going in to assess and respond year in, year out, we need to engage with communities and groups to hand over in a dignified and responsible way, to withdraw and then to support. And this is, I think, a development approach to humanitarian response. But I think it's important that development and humanitarian actors collaborate better. Otherwise, we are saving the same lives again and again and again without fewer and fewer resources. So there's a need for a much more cohesive approach to that, to integrate relief with longer term developments. And even, but as Nino says, it comes down to donors as well. I mean, from a funding point of view, donors have two funding streams and doesn't help. And they are on the executive boards of NGOs and UN agencies, and they basically echo that when they are talking to those parties and funding those parties. So I think it's important we get that conversation right. And I think Nexus is a way forward, but let's not hang all of our future on a very shaky nail.
Well, as we wrap up here, and perhaps you've already touched on it, Jamie, but what 1, 2, 3 things would you focus on moving forward that could be game changers? Where does the sector need to go in the next 5 years, and what would you focus on? First to you, Jamie.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that need to be done, but there's a lot of things that can't change. We have a bunker mentality, with the political pressures that are out there, the geopolitical, the polarization. I think the impact, the way we are instrumentalized by political actors, and we've got the two sides of the coin, increased numbers of levels of conflict and displacement, and this lack. I think there's a lack of political will to solve the core issues. And obviously, a massive funding crisis in the sector as well, downsizing of international NGOs and UN agencies. And the development and humanitarian system, I think, needs to be more sort of coherent and much, I think, repurposed in many ways. So I would say a radical reform conversation needs to take place. I mean, right now we're talking about the SDGs, for example, development. The SDGs, there's 15% of the SDG targets are on track. And the thing is, the developing countries are caught in a debt trap. They're borrowing at rates much higher than European countries. We see the fiscal crisis that caused the lack of services there. So we can't just look at it as a humanitarian sector. If we're going to improve the system, the approach, the way to save people's lives, we've got to look at it in a much more, I think, a much more coherent approach. For me, it's changing the humanitarian model right now. I think it's tired, as rudderless. There's a bigger drive needed for localization and empowerment. I think there needs to be a bigger commitment from the international system, not just policy papers and pilot schemes and initiatives. And I think also more attention to the humanitarian impact of climate disaster. John, this is where development and humanitarian actors can come together. And then lastly, I would say that we have to think more strategically as humanitarians, much more worldly in terms of humanitarian diplomacy. Getting relationships at the highest level, negotiating access, helping influence actors who are stopping access, state and non-state actors, and at the same time raising protection issues, making it become something that we have to hang on to differently. The protection of civilians gets dumped into a corner, and they need to find solutions and to prevent and reduce humanitarian need because the money is running out.
Nimo, you get the last word. What are the 2 or 3 things? I think you're probably agreeing with Jamie on a lot of them, but what would you focus on moving forward?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Jamie in many of the issues he raised. I would say we need to do things differently. It can't be business as usual. And I think we need to challenge ourselves and challenge the systems that we've built. The system, the layer of the system is just getting bigger and bigger. I think we do need to streamline because it's not fit for purpose. It does not support the communities that it's supposed to support. It does not work with the right actors that it's supposed to work with. So I think we need to get out our own heads, get out our own way, and ensure that we are delivering on our commitments. It's not just about it's not about making those commitments, because I think a lot of the donors make the commitments to support communities in need, to put people at the center, at the heart of the response. But I think we don't deliver on them. And who holds who accountable? We talk about accountability to affected communities, but is there a system in place for those communities to hold donors accountable, to ensure that donors are actually delivering on their commitments as well? So I think it's a two-way trust, and it's a two-way risk as well. So if we want communities to trust us, then we need to deliver on our commitments. Bottom line, that's what I would say. Thank you.
Well, trust, embracing risk sounds like a nice place to end. I wish the 2 of you were in charge moving forward. I want to thank you both for taking the time. This has been great. And everyone, you can find the rest of the issue at wilsonquarterly.com. Thank you.
Thank you very much.